Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Residential, a podcast by MCM Collective. I'm Kelly McBartlett, and we're joined today by two special guests, Bailey Jensen, our creative director, and Blake McBartlett, a principal and founding agent with MCM Collective, and CSU's Everitt Real Estate School director and lecturer of real estate. So, Blake.
Hello.
Long time no see.
Yes.
Today.
It's been about 5 minutes.
So what initially drew you to real estate as a career path?
So my real estate journey kind of began when I was in junior high, and I really, really wanted my parents to buy a new house. So I grew up in Cheyenne, back in the time where open houses were printed in the weekly newspaper. So every Saturday and Sunday, there was a list of all the open houses that we could go to. And I used to beg my parents to take me to at least like 2 or 3 open houses every single week. And that's really when I fell in love with real estate.
Some things never change, babe. I'm thinking about my weekends. That's what it is. So now you operate at this interesting intersection of real estate sales and academia. So what do you think is important for people to understand and your students to understand about real estate and the future of real estate?
Yeah, I think that the intersection between real estate and higher education is really unique. To be able to become a real estate agent in terms of like residential sales or commercial sales, you don't have to have a higher education, but really advocating for education and telling our students like, this is what's going to make you different. This is going to be your differentiator. It's more than just brick or mortar. It's like, how does finance come into play? How does like standard economic practices come into play? How does urban planning? How do all of those things combine give you a holistic approach to kind of look at the field and why that is so important and why that sets people who successfully complete the program versus people who just like come right out of high school and do this job.
And I'm sure Northern Colorado has its own niche as well. So what would you say sets Northern Colorado apart in those ways?
Yeah, so one thing I talk a lot about in my class is like ethics and competency. We technically licensed to sell across the entire state, but that doesn't mean that we should. So really focusing on like local markets and being an expert in your area. Even Northern Colorado as a whole is segmented. There's different market trends from Fort Collins versus Loveland. There's certain adjacencies that impact values more in Fort Collins versus Loveland. And those towns are adjacent in our community, and people live and work in different facets of those. So I think just being able to really understand the nuances of the markets and kind of what drives the economic factors and price points is really, really important.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess along those same lines, what do you feel like are just kind of consistent drivers, no matter where you're located? Healthcare is something that comes to mind. So what else would you?
From Northern Colorado.
Yeah.
CSU is our largest employer, followed by the county and large health systems. A unique thing about our market is that we're aging. The average age of our communities are getting higher. Schools are closing in our community. More and more working class families are moving to neighboring communities that are a little bit more affordable. And I would say the average home buyer now, for first-time home buyers, is in their mid-40s. 41, I think, is assisted right now. And we're seeing a big influx of people who are empty nesters, retirees that are moving to our community for the lifestyle. We're really close to recreation, about an hour away from Rocky Mountain National Park, about an hour and 15 minutes away from DIA. And we have a really, really strong healthcare system here that really promotes this active lifestyle, very Colorado, with the amenities to get into Denver, but far enough away where you can play.
Yeah, you're still in touch with nature, but you also have that attachment to health and wellness.
It's really cool. So a lot of people focus on interest rates when they're thinking about the economics of real estate. What do you tell your students is also important to factor in?
Yeah, one of my favorite classes is appraisal, which essentially is home valuation. We really strict to residential, not commercial focus, just based on access to data. Supply and demand is, I think, the most important piece of real estate. And I think being able to really look at average days on market, months of inventory, absorption rates, I think are equally as important when looking at making a home purchase based on scarcity. we have an influx of inventory, is what people say. However, we're at a national shortage in terms of homes that we need, which kind of then is another economic driver for affordability.
So when you start looking like at future communities or like maybe new communities that are up and coming or some that are kind of starting to turn over, like what do you feel like are really good indicators for like a community that shows good promise for it to thrive in the next like 10 to 20 years?
I think in our region, Northern Colorado, I think like north of Denver, I think one of the hardest things we're running into is space. Fort Collins, they have like the Boulder benchmark is something that the founder of a real estate company here in town references a lot. That Fort Collins is 10 years behind Boulder, and then Greeley is 10 years behind Fort Collins. And that's based on like sheer space. So when you think about like Fort Collins appreciation, you really can't go west because you hit the foothills, you hit the reservoir. You really can't go south because there's tons of conservation land that the city of Fort Collins and Member County have developed. You really can't go east anymore because you've hit I-25. And if you go north, there's more conservation land, protected land, and then you hit into Wellington. So now we're really seeing homes for like redevelopment or like scrape projects or infill projects. And you kind of pay a premium to live in Fort Collins now because there just isn't anywhere else to go.
Well, that makes sense because then like that new benchmark starts to get set as well for like what are your comps that are in the area?
Yeah, one of our team agents, Anna, she lives in a really great community in Midtown. There wasn't a sale in her new neighborhood since 2022. Since she's bought her home, there's been 4 houses on the market. So her purchase kind of was a domino effect in terms of like a new appreciation. And this neighborhood is now kind of catapulted into another price point just based on the demand for the location and access to Old Town, Midtown, I-25. So what used to maybe be a little bit behind another more prominent neighborhood, it really is almost apples to apples now.
I've even seen that with buyers that recently that have bought properties that are off market or highly competitive that are lakefront in the summer Fort Collins because they wanted to be nowhere else, and they were willing to pay a really substantial premium for something that they'll essentially probably start over from scratch. So it kind of echoes what you're saying about with Anna. So in line with that, Blake, what separates a house that simply appreciates at market rate versus a property that's kind of that legacy value-add property?
I would say size and location. In terms of like legacy properties in our community, I place there's like 5 distinct neighborhoods that I can really think of that are really legacy homes. Fossil Lake Ranch is probably being one of them. Kind of early 2000s construction, half-acre lots, probably 5,000 to 8,000 square feet. So really good school districts that feed into it. So like larger homes of like families. There's some lake communities that you had just mentioned in terms of lake access. Old Town Fort Collins, and then a few pocket neighborhoods on the western side that are closer to the foothills, easier access up to the reservoir. So really location, I think, is really, really big. And then I think the other thing that is really unique about these neighborhoods that I've referenced is the architecture. They're not cookie-cutter neighborhoods. They're not mass-produced. It's all custom. And then kind of the Midtown areas that are more popular, we're seeing a lot of these homes being purchased and being completely remodeled, new fascias, new architectural styles being put in, expansions, kind of moving away from the 70s architecture a little bit and kind of going up just based on sheer space.
Would you feel like, I guess, those new pushes in architecture and design, like, do you feel like that's kind of like what is redefining like luxury for Northern Colorado, or do you feel like there are other like strong indicators in that direction too?
I would say Midtown, for neighborhoods that are kind of gentrifying or like homes are being purchased and like being remodeled like pretty extensively. And I say remodeled, I mean, we're talking like $500,000 budgets.
Yeah.
I think people either like lean into the architecture when it was developed, or they completely change the facade and move to what's more like contemporary or more modern construction now. That could be based on like exterior like facades. It could be based on like floor plans, and then back again to size.
Yeah, Kelly, I guess I'd like be curious to know your opinion on that too. Like, do you, speaking to the point that Blake just made about whether you restore like a historical home or you decide to move more into like that modern ecosystem, like what do you feel like is actually moving in Northern Colorado, or do you feel like it's really contingent on like who that buyer is?
I really think it's based on the buyer, because some buyers really like to embrace the architecture of a property. They have kind of a desire to maintain and renovate and restore. Other people are really driven by the function in their life. And so they might say, we really need this size of master bedroom, these 4 rooms, an office, a laundry room, and a really great open kitchen. And in that scenario, it's probably very difficult to fit it into that sort of space that you're originally working with. And so, working with a good architect or a good builder and interior designer, that team can really help you define what's important to you and move in the direction that is best for your needs. So
I also feel like right now, in today's market, people are paying for convenience in terms of they're paying a premium for things that are already done well. And homes that are in these prime locations that are large, that have been redone, they're on the market for like a week. And that would say that ranges from like price points from like 1.2 up to like 2.5. If they're in these specific primary neighborhoods that are really highly sought after, they're well done, and they are functional. Like they're moving really, really quickly. So definitely focusing on that in the luxury threshold for like the specific piece. But I think people are paying a premium for it to be completed.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast the other day that was kind of talking about, obviously how wealth is becoming a bit more concentrated, and how in higher, net worth communities, they're starting to see like a resurgence of small businesses coming back into play. And I think it's speaking to exactly what you're talking about, which is like having access to these like little delights that are executed really well. I think it's the same thing in your home. Like if you partner with the right builder or the right interior designer, we were filming a podcast shortly before this, and we were talking about like maximizing the use of your spaces so that they function really well. So yeah, I think I agree with you that I feel like luxury is really more about not necessarily just finishes or selections. It's kind of how does everything come together, and then how does that play out in the future too, because when we talk about even like multi-generational living, and that's starting to become more popularized because not everybody can afford to get into the real estate market. Like Blake, I'd be so curious to know your thoughts about, they say like the new entry level is, approaching like $1 million for a first-time home buyer. So how does that play out for like Northern Colorado specifically?
Yeah, I think we might have read the same article. I think there's 4 communities in Colorado where the first-time home buyer threshold is $1 million. I think right now for single family, I think 450 to 500,000 is probably an entry point in Fort Collins, maybe like 400 in Loveland. I think if you go cross I-25 into like 10 minutes in Windsor, I think you're looking at like 475 to 550 depending on the neighborhood. So it's still like overall Fort Collins is still affordable. It's still accessible for working professionals. And I feel like we've seen a really big increase in inventory, like not the inventory, but sales in the upper part of the market. And I feel like our entry market and our luxury market, I feel like those thresholds are getting further and further apart.
Sure.
Like I don't think we're going to see as many middle of the road homes anymore. And I feel like you're either up or you're kind of at the entry point.
Well, and it sounds like right now is a good time to enter into the Northern Colorado market because, from what we've seen for appreciation, which I'm sure you can speak more to, but, also we're getting in at a semi-affordable price point compared to the rest of the nation or really coveted communities. But Fort Collins and Northern Colorado are putting a lot of money into developing these communities to be the same.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of land like northeast of town, but other than that, like, that's it.
yeah.
So if you want to have a new home in Fort Collins, that probably means that you're either going to be scraping what was there before or doing a significant remodel. And as we just learned, remodels are not more affordable.
Yeah.
They're more expensive.
Yeah, typically. But it's interesting too because to that point, the other thing that's more affordable about Fort Collins than many of our surrounding communities is there's not as many metro districts in Fort Collins as most other communities, and so that certainly keeps costs lower for people trying to get into the market. So speaking of that, though, I do have a lot of clients that will ask, what makes a home resilient across market cycles? What protects their value essentially if they do purchase in a community? So what do you think those fundamentals are?
I keep on saying like location, 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 but truly, I mean, location. I feel like during COVID, we kind of had like a big swing in terms of like how location was prioritized. It was more about like homes being large enough to work from home. And I feel like people are getting away from like home function and kind of moving back more towards location. Like people are willing to have smaller homes for a better location in town, or maybe a less functional home within a better school district. In our community, we do have school of choice, but if that's always not guaranteed. So if you're really wanting to get into a certain school, it might be a certain neighborhood. So I feel like there's been a shift since COVID, going from like size now more towards location, and people are wanting to kind of live and play in the same community. I think more again than I think it was during like the height of the pandemic.
Sure.
And I think that is also evident based on like what people are building in Fort Collins. There's a few different communities that are newer that are still like developing, and the average square foot is maybe 2,000 square feet.
Right.
Versus if you kind of go east of I-25, you're looking at like 3,500 to like 5,000 square feet in a lot of like the newer construction neighborhoods.
I'd be curious, like, to hear from both of you, like, what do you feel like the demographics are that are moving to those? Like, specifically age, I guess, is what comes to mind. Like, do you feel like that's more the idea of like choice of specifically like where they want to live, or do you feel like it's also contingent on affordability, or for the two examples?
Just these are first. Yeah, we go. I feel like it's like a one and. I feel like for making things more affordable in Fort Collins, we're looking at higher density and like more 2 stories. So that kind of like pigeonholes you to a certain buyer demographic. As I mentioned, you have an aging population, so primary bedrooms on the main floor is like really highly sought after.
Sure.
But if you're moving towards like higher density, smaller lots, that forces bedrooms upstairs. So that product type really pigeonholes you to maybe not the primary demographic of like who's moving into the community, and maybe looking more towards like small families or like working professionals who maybe don't have children.
Sure. So, right. I mean, it's kind of a balancing act when you think about, buyers, whether they're families or retirees that are moving into Fort Collins. If it's a family, they might really like the floor plans, but they might also be seeking more community amenities that more of the newer developers are focusing on, like pools in the neighborhood, or walking trails and paths, which are accessible in Fort Collins, but usually not directly in your neighborhood, with few exceptions. If you're a retiree looking at Fort Collins, you might be not finding the right product type at the price that you want, because like Blake just mentioned, floor plans might necessitate going upstairs instead of being on the primary level, or some additional work to add a bedroom on that main level. But it's where you want to be. It's where all of the restaurants are and all of your friends are, and access to music in Old Town. So I think it's always a balancing act for both demographics.
Yeah, I feel like a theme that people haven't really said in our buyer interviews is connection to community.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like that is becoming more and more important to people. They might not use those exact words, but they're thinking about like, how far is it to my favorite restaurant? How far is it to my best friend? How far is it to my favorite grocery store? And like the sense of community, I feel like is becoming more and more important.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because like you see the surgence of like, I don't know, I think about like Lifetime Fitness, right? And you think of like companies like that are investing in these ecosystems that you have access to everything from medical testing to being able to go downstairs to get a smoothie to like, I don't even know, have like your infrared sauna or like whatever it is that you want.
Amazon Fitness.
Yeah, but in addition to that, like you also develop this community and this group of individuals. And, like with so many longevity studies, you're looking at like what's the impact of people and having them in close proximity to you as you age, especially if someone passes, between a couple. So it's interesting to see, I think, that shift of, once everyone always wanting like the maximum square footage possible. But now, I think to your points earlier, I think size, but also location matters, and making sure that both are being balanced accordingly.
Well, and sometimes, I don't know if you agree with this, but sometimes in Fort Collins, it's pointing out to people that the planners have been really thoughtful in the way that they've designed the entire city. Mm-hmm. And so local restaurants and eateries and breweries and parks are all so close by to most neighborhoods that you're going to be finding your community and meeting up with people you like in those areas, rather than a community-focused neighborhood.
Yeah, just in one building. Yeah.
Rather than like a master plan community. So do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the intentional design of the city, like driving across Fort Collins at 5 o'clock now, it takes a long time. Yeah, like,
and that was on purpose.
It was intentional. It was helping like live where you work, bikeability. I mean, you can sometimes bike faster across town than you can drive. And that's with intention, because you kind of build these like micro pockets. I mean, Fort Collins is never going to be a Denver, but we're starting to kind of have like more of a borough type community feel, which is kind of fun to watch.
Well, and sometimes I don't think like Denver is what everybody's looking for, right? Like I think so many of us go into like smaller communities and we're like reminded of that, you know, small town charm that we grew up with, and it's very like nostalgic and comforting in those ways. And I think it's very different here, like when I come up to see you guys, because I, you know, I'm based in Denver, you know, everybody waves, everybody stops, and they have an extra 15 minutes to have a conversation with you. So I think that there's also that resurgence of like appreciating close-knit communities, which I feel like Northern Colorado has done really well.
Yeah, it's fun to like bebop around an old town, and like if you go out, you see someone you know, and it's just...
Hopefully someone you like.
Yes. Not always, but sometimes.
This, that, and in between. Like sitting on a patio in Old Town where you're sure to run into people you know, just because the community, even though it's 200,000 people, you know people. So, so what do you think, what kind of opportunities exist today in Northern Colorado that 10 years ago maybe weren't obvious, that looking back, people should have paid more attention to?
That is a really good question. I think they should have got into the market 10 years ago. I mean, growing up in Cheyenne, I would come down to Fort Collins for the big city. Like if you wanted to go to the Olive Garden, we would go. And I remember when they built the Home Depot on like South College and Harmony, who like, why in the world are they building this here? Now that's like almost Midtown. And like, there's really been so much development. So I think, I mean, if you look at the market trends and the market data, Fort Collins is a really, it's a sure thing. So just getting into the market and not dilly-dally, you know.
Can you talk to me a little bit more about like what you have seen like historically as far as like appreciation and values go?
Yeah, you know, it's been really interesting. I would say on average, people used to say like 7.5% year over year was kind of the norm. We had 2 years, like 23 or 24 or 22, 23.
21, 22.
Okay. Where we saw like double digits, like 17% appreciation each year. Since those high appreciation years, it's really been flat, which is...
It's stable.
Yeah, it's kind of like we're letting it catch back up. So if you were to look at the overall appreciation growth, we're still heading that to 7.5% year over year. But we had to kind of taper that down a little bit. I mean, that much growth was not sustainable for anybody. I mean, the market just couldn't keep up. And no one would be able to afford houses at that point. So, you know, we're kind of riding... This year will be interesting to kind of see how, like, the maths, to see if they kind of start moving up a little bit. But statistically, if you're to kind of level out that high appreciation growth for those 2 years, this would be the last year where, like, we would see that absorption rate for the higher appreciation, which would probably put us next year on the map of a statistical normal, like 7.5% appreciation.
But that's still pretty high, like considering like across nationally, right? Yeah, it's almost double. Yeah.
Interesting. So when we think about those couple years of appreciation, those were really driven by remote work. And that was happening here and other places as well. And now we're kind of seeing remote work normalize a little bit. What do you think that looks like for Northern Colorado in the future? Is that going to be something that will drive our market in the future, or how will people factor that in when they look across the nation and Northern Colorado?
You know, I would love to have a crystal ball because I think we'd all make a lot of money.
That's why we're talking to you. Blake.
Yes, sign the
I'm glad we're on the same page.
This is the purpose. Get rich quick with Blake. No, you know, I think it's interesting because it's like the whole like time period, like pre-COVID, post-COVID, and remote work. You know, I think there's been this like demand pushed back to the office, and I think like I've experienced that. I mean, people who like work in the community who used to be remote like 1 day are now like 3 days. So I think people who like live and work in Fort Collins, I think they're going to see this influx of people moving back in. And we have a very unique demographic who is choosing to live here based on lifestyle. So the higher age demographic, or higher, I'm trying to think what nice way to say that, older.
Aging gracefully?
Yes.
Those that are aging gracefully.
Yes. An active lifestyle. So I think we're going to see an influx of both of those people moving back to Fort Collins who are working here, and this new population who's choosing to live here, and being intentional about that. But the unique thing about that is our sales year over year are going down. So I think between like the influx of people probably wanting to move back into Fort Collins, people wanting to move here, but inventory continues to kind of drop year over year, it just basic economic supply and demand. If our supply is going down, like not it's drastically, but it's like edging down, and then supplies or demand's going up.
Praise Barn.
I think it's going to get more protective. It's interesting. What do you think, Kelly?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think the demographic we're not talking a lot about is the people that have gone to school at CSU, where you teach, and move away for whatever reason and then come back here to raise families. There's a big demographic of that person too, that I think will seek the remote work opportunities where they can, just so they can be back in this community. But it's, time will tell.
And I also think like being close to family and having that as a resource too. Like obviously I think it's great to like raise your kids among your family, but I also think like you look at the cost of like childcare and, having to farm that out. It's like
Takes a village.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. So like back to like a multi-generational living. I have a market data class. It's this like quasi construction development class. And we had a specific property with the space to add an ADU. And the project for all the students was to like give me the best pro forma for ADU. And at the end of that project, based on like local municipality policy changes of being able to add ADUs, the conclusion across all of the students were like, this actually isn't feasible. It actually makes more sense for someone to buy like maybe a little bit of a cheaper home is having a second property off-site than it would be to add the ADU just based on construction costs as well, and like the limitations on size. So I think for affordability, there's this big push for like AUs are going to solve all of our problems. And I think we educate our community about policy change, like the policy impact could be. But in terms of like financial feasibility at addressing affordability, it's not really realistic.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah, because I mean, the entire state has now moved to allow ADU development. So
Yeah, so it's if you can afford to have an ADU and it's convenient for your family, awesome.
do it.
Are you going to get the dollar return when you're all done?
Absolutely not. Yeah, interesting. Well, we'll see how that goes. So if you could leave our listeners or your students with one thing, what would it be?
About real estate. About real estate?
Life.
Well, life advice.
Let's sit down. It's not for the weak. There's going to be some seasonality, and you really have to be intentional and just kind of like listen. I would say less, listen more. And you really have to respond to the market, because if you're not in tune, you're going to get left behind. I think the biggest place where I've seen this with different brokers in our community is around pricing. Like people are trying to push prices in certain parts of the market. I'm like, you missed the mark. And then I could see the opposite side is people haven't really acknowledged these like high growth areas in town in terms of their brand appreciation based on limited inventory, and they're giving houses away. I mean, $50,000 is $50,000, and if you're overpricing by 50 or underpricing by 50, it makes a big impact.
Pricing is important.
So yeah, pricing is important, I think, is probably also what I would say.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. It's a lot of fun. We'll have you back regularly.
You too, Baylor.
Me as well.
Yeah.
Maybe Brian will hang out with us too.
Yeah. That will do for next time. We'll see you all next time.